Really tough spot for the Oilers right now. If they knew Evander Kane couldn't play until the postseason, the Oilers could use all of his $5.125 million in cap space in a trade between now and the deadline. But if he's coming back in the regular season, they've got no cap space at all. So, Ryan, what do the Oilers know about his timeline at this point?
Yeah, not a lot, I don't think, Gino. I think that there's a couple of things at play here, right? So Evander Kane's in the middle of trying to work his way back in, right? He's skating pretty much on a daily basis from what it sounds like. He's going really hard. And I think at a certain point here, the Oilers, their doctors have done or will continue to do these evaluations on him. But it's kind of prognosticating. It's figuring out what his timeline looks like it's going to be. But even if doctors say, he won't be back till the second week of the playoffs, even if they say that, and Evander Kane's recovery goes extremely well, and Evander Kane is quite the athlete. He's one of those guys. He's a bit of a freak of nature. Like, he is incredible athletically. So you wouldn't put it past a guy to be able to get ready ahead of schedule. So even if they think he's not going to be back, in the absence of some sort of understanding that he's not coming back till the playoffs, and I do not believe that understanding exists at all, they're in a tough spot here figuring out whether they can spend this money or not. Because even if their doctors say it's unlikely, you never know. There's always the chance. So they're in a tough spot here. There's definitely gray area.
Evander Kane hasn't played since Game 7 of last year's Cup final. How do you compare the team today to the one that bowed out from Game 7 last year?
Yeah. And I'll remind you, Gino, he actually wasn't available. Like, that injury was something he was battling through that playoff series and ended up having to cut it off early. He wasn't available for them towards the end of the season. And he's a big loss from this team, right? Like, they would like to have Evander Kane, if he's healthy, back, because he's a lot of what this team needs. But your point about this year's roster compared to last year's roster, it's not the same. I'd say that there are a lot of deficiencies on this year's team, Gino. So Darnell Nurse said today, it's funny, like, sometimes if you're just a degree off, it can look like everything needs to be adjusted or like wholesale changes are needed. So I'm not going to point these things out suggesting that everything has to change, but let's run it down here, Gino. Compared to last year's team, the Oilers are not as fast. The Oilers are nowhere near as physical. They're slower. They're older in their bottom six. Their penalty kill is near the bottom 5-6 teams in the league, when, remember, before it was phenomenal. The power play is no longer a top 5 power play. Evan Bouchard has regressed. Stuart Skinner has regressed. Connor McDavid is having a season that is not Connor McDavid-like at all. So there's not a lot of things that are creating the idea that this team is hurtling towards another dash to the Stanley Cup final. Now, with that said, if a few of those things turn around and they get a bit of help with the deadline, absolutely this team is still a good team, and they've shown that this year. But it's not the same as the one that hit the playoffs last year. So we'll see what they can do to try and remedy that.
So, Ryan, you come up with a grocery list of issues that this team is facing right now, and yet to spend money on the groceries, they don't have any available cap space. So what do they do between now and the deadline? How do you move bodies out of value to get some value back? How do you make something like that happen?
Yeah, sorcery. I don't know. Like, it's money in, money out it's a difficult proposition, right? So, do the Oilers have some players that they would be okay trading off of this roster to make space? Of course. I think we all know that the situation with Jeff Skinner hasn't gone great this year, right? Well, there's a no movement clause that's in place there. Victor Arvidsson, these are both players that were brought in to bolster the top 6, and it hasn't worked with either of them. Again, there's a no movement clause there. So, there are pieces you can move, but when it's dollar out, dollar in, now you're having, if you think you're getting something back that makes you better, well, the only way you're doing that is if you're attaching assets, right? You're wrapping them in draft picks and such. And the Oilers don't have a ton of those. And then the other thing here, Gino, is that while it would be great for them to make some big ad at this year's deadline, you also have to remember that at a certain point, if you're negotiating with Connor McDavid's camp and you say, here are all the reasons why the outlook is bright here, and you open up the cupboards and there's, a spilled bottle of honey and that's it. It's just empty. That's not great, right? So you can't necessarily just strip the cupboards bare in an all-out effort for the moment. It's this tough balance. And Stan Bowman's, he's in a tough spot here. He's going to have to figure this out. But the idea that they're going to really, truly, meaningfully improve this team if they don't have Kane's money to spend, that's going to take some pretty fancy GMing.
Well, Ryan, let me just say in your defense, you're not being pessimistic at this point. You're just being realistic, as much as that hurts for Oiler Nation. Ryan Rishaug from Edmonton.